Hey, Dr. C here with you. So, should you be taking a probiotic every day? Well, I would argue that the items that you would take all the time, just because, should be a really short list. If you make the criteria too lax about the things you take on a daily basis, you'll soon be taking a lot of pills and they get to be counterproductive. Now, having said that, we've got a lot of evidence about benefits for probiotics for certain circumstances. So if you've got ongoing digestive issues, if you're susceptible or prone to infections, these things can have their place. There's good evidence behind that. But I want to talk through briefly when they're helpful, when they're not, which ones might be useful, and what are they good for. If you want a quick summary, here's the basic idea. If your digestive system works great, if your thyroid stays pretty steady, you've got no real ongoing infections, you've got a good immune system, you do pretty well tolerating carbohydrate, they're probably not something you need. They're not elements that are necessary for your diet. And furthermore, there are people who have immunosuppressed situations. We have people that are on immunosuppressant medications. We have those who are on chemotherapy. And there actually are a few case studies of people who have gotten horribly ill from the normally good bacteria and probiotics when their immune systems are shut down. Now, we've got different types of probiotics as well. So here's the Cliff's Notes. We can think about those as fungal and as bacterial. And I'll go into more about what these mean in various types, but this is the quick summary for someone who's in a rush. Fungal probiotics, this is basically Saccharomyces boulardii. These are a good thing if you are taking an antibiotic to prevent against antibiotic-associated diarrhea. These are good things if you're taking an oral contraceptive or oral hormone replacements of other types. These are a good idea if you're traveling and prone to traveler's diarrhea, or if you've got some unexplained infectious diarrhea. Saccharomyces is something you would take just once daily normally. You look for ones that have 10 billion or more viable organisms per capsule, and you can take those with or without food. It honestly doesn't matter. Then we think about bacterial probiotics, and with those, there's a lot of different strains. I'll talk about some of those, but I would argue that the blended ones are more useful. I really like Lactobacillus acidophilus, Plantarum, Rhamnosus, Pericaceae, and then Bifidobacterium lactis and Bifidum as good items to include. You would think about these if you had hypothyroidism, irritable bowel syndrome, constipation, ulcerative colitis, or airborne allergies. Actually, not good data on Crohn's disease, but yeah, all those others. With these, shoot for about 100 billion viable organisms. Take that once daily. Now, the timing is kind of funny. You can do it before a meal or with a meal, but don't do it after a meal. Like 15 to 90 minutes after a meal probably won't be effective. So pretty surprising. Another quick tip you might not have thought of is that don't take a probiotic with bacteria within 3 days of having your thyroid antibodies tested. It could skew your levels. You could have false elevations. Not true for fungal probiotics. And if you did have concerns that fit under both those categories, you can do one of each. You could do a bacterial and a fungal probiotic. They can be taken together at the same time. They're not going to blow up together. No real drawbacks that way. And apart from those who are immunosuppressed, probiotics are pretty safe. It's worth knowing, though, that if you do start one, you may have changes in your bowels as the flora shifts. As you've got old stuff dying off and new stuff taking over, possible that's some gas or bloating, especially if you've been on a more restrictive diet. So that's the synopsis, and I'll give a little more detail here, and you can always get the rest and the references in the blog post. So we've had this microbiome revolution of sorts over this last a decade, somewhere around there, I'd say. And the funny thing is, we always want to think about what are the levers that we can pull to improve our health, to reverse symptoms, to reverse chronic diseases. And as we figure out what are the levers, the first thing we have to figure out are what are the correlates, what are the things that relate to what's important to us. And there's been this spate of shocking research showing that anything you can think of seems to correlate with the gut flora. Any symptom, any metric of health, any disease condition, it seems that the flora can be relevant to that. And it's a tempting assumption to say, therefore, we can manipulate the flora and change the disease. And really, this is a matter of sorting out correlation and causation. And then even past that, whether there's correlation and causation, whether there's a powerful lever or not. So here's what I mean. Correlation and causation, I've heard the analogy of umbrellas and rain. Umbrellas are out on rainy days. Umbrellas don't cause rain. But there still are things where correlation and causation can fit together, but you can't control one and control the other. That's the whole horse out of the barn analogy. Yeah, the barn door let the horse out, but closing the door may not bring the horse back in. So we want to know what's correlation and causation, and then what's actionable. What can we change that'll still change things? So what happened was that our cycle of understanding was first that we knew very little about the flora. Some of the earliest things were, it's probably good for something, massive antibiotic use can cause some issues, perhaps probiotics are useful, and it was left at that. And then it was this idea of every symptom disease process seeming to relate. Well, now we're pruning that back. We're seeing that, yes, the flora is like a hologram of the body. If you change the body, you'll change many facets of your chemistry, including the flora. But that doesn't mean that the change in the flora caused the change in the body. So now we're pruning back. And many of the ways in which we thought the flora affects everything, we're shortening that list. But we're getting a list that's going to be a little more meaningful from it all, because it does affect a lot. And there are many ways in which the flora, even if the change in it is not what changes our health, it's still reflective of changes that are relevant. So here's what I mean by that. The flora can often be a marker of one's diet. If your diet has a richer amount of plant foods, a big variety of fibers, you'll have a more diverse flora, and you'll probably have a lower risk for metabolic syndrome and other diseases. Now, does that mean that the flora lower the risk for the disease per se? Like if you could just take someone who has an unhealthy diet and somehow pump in the bacteria, that they would shift? It's seeming more like the flora is a consequence of our diet, our stress levels, our lifestyle. And so the real levers, many of them may go back to that point, to the actual things we address and change, not just the flora. But let's get back to our basic concept here and cover some key starting definitions. So for starters, we're going to think about the term probiotic itself. And this is just Latin for life. Things are supportive of life. And we've used fermented foods for a long time, even before it was done on purpose. Before we had refrigeration, we would find various ways to keep food from going bad. Probably the earliest iteration of that was burying it. Then we would find ways of curing and smoking and fermenting. And these have been traditional foods for quite some time. And we now know that these foods, they give us flora and they aid in digestive function. Then you'll hear about prebiotics. And prebiotics, these are variants of fibers. And I always like to emphasize the plural of fibers, because all too often people say fiber, and it makes limited thinking. You think about fiber as if it is a thing. It's really a category. I've talked about this with nutrients in so many ways, like vitamin K, it's a category. Vitamin E is a category. These things are groups of many constituents. And same thing for fiber. If fiber were just a thing, you could chug down some Metamucil and then just have processed food all day long and be fine, right? But we know that wouldn't work. Metamucil is one kind of fiber. That's cool. But there's at least about 16 that we would ideally have in our diets to keep us healthy. And the more narrow the diet gets, the fewer fiber types that we have access to, and the more our flora lacks in diversity. And that's what we're learning now. It's not about just massive numbers of bacteria. It's about the strains and their relationships amongst one another. So in terms of prebiotics in the diet, it's not about chugging massive amounts of Jerusalem artichokes or any one particular food. It's about your range of food categories. And if you cut out a lot of food categories, it's not really practically possible to have a diverse flora. There are some fiber types that we only find in intact whole grains. There's many fiber types we only find in legumes. Many are only in nuts, or only in seeds, or only in cruciferous vegetables. So you want a full spectrum of foods. I'm not against animal foods by any means, but animal foods don't have fibers in them. They are exclusively in plant foods. And fibers are distinct in that they're non-caloric or they're partially caloric, but they feed the flora. And just one of many fiber types I've talked about a lot has been resistant starch. And this has had probably the biggest body of research as far as its good effects upon the flora. And it seems that a marker of good health of our microbiome is when we've got a lot of these short chain fatty acids. So there's things like butyrate, acetate, propionate. And when they're abundant, we've got a low risk for colorectal cancer. We've got really good regulation of our blood sugar. We've also got better metabolic rate, easier time maintaining body size, easier time regulating blood sugar. So these are all things that are specific to resistant starch and its effects upon those short chain fats. It's funny because butyrate, we find that in butter. And I've heard an argument about the benefits of consuming butter for raising butyrate. But you get down to the math on that and it gets pretty sketchy. So butyrate is useful when you get up in the thousands of milligrams, up in the gram amounts. And we think it's about 6 to 8 grams a day for a healthy colon in terms of butyrate production. How much butter would that take? I did the math one time. It was north of a cup 3 times a day. So it was something like 4,000 calories of butter per day to get to that amount of butyrate. A teaspoon of butter, it's 100 so milligrams. So like 1/80th of a useful dose. Whereas if you're talking about half a cup of beans, you're golden. You can do really well with just simple food sources. And it's indirect, because the flora themselves, they make the butyrate out of resistant starch. So yeah, butter has pure butyrate, but not much. Whereas the flora can just make massive amounts when you give it good amounts of high RS foods. So those are the prebiotics. There's others. There's some that may cause symptoms. We hear about the FODMAPs diet, the fructooligosaccharides, other versions of prebiotics. And there's been some arguing concern about these things being harmful. And the funny thing is that there's not a lot of activity that these compounds have in the small intestine. They're mostly in the large intestine. So in terms of SIBO, we wouldn't worry as much about fiber and prebiotics being harmful for SIBO because they're not causing bacterial growth in the small intestine. They're more active in the large. That's especially true for resistant starch. In fact, by definition, resistant starch resists digestion. So it's not breaking down in the small intestine. And that's why it is fine for those that do have SIBO or symptoms like that. Then we also have synbiotics. And these are basically just products that are going to be combining probiotics and prebiotics. And it makes sense to see those together. And then last up, we've got biosurfactants. And this is a fancy thing for talking about soaps. And there are some versions of these in the diet. There are some versions of these in supplemental form. But surfactants make the hydrogen bonds weaker. They make surface tension not as robust. So things get wetter, things get slipperier, just like soap. Soap makes water wetter, the dirt comes off easier. A lot of negative organisms can form biofilms, they can form bonds or adhesive substrates in the intestinal tract, and surfactants make that less probable. So you will hear about those too. In the article, I'll make a list of some comprehensive items, the full list of organisms that are present. These are categorized by a thing called binomial nomenclature, which is just organization by 2 names. And think about this as first name, last name. We've got genus and species, and so genus is like the last name, and species is like the first name. So you'll see a lot of things under the genus of Lactobacillus, for example, or many under Bifidobacter as well. So these are the main categories for bacteria. And then there's really only one fungal strain that you'll see in products, and that's Saccharomyces. And that one's kind of interesting because, yeah, it's a fungal. And we're used to thinking about fungi as being bad, as being harmful. And for sure, overgrowth of some strains can be infectious and can be harmful. But it turns out Saccharomyces has some uniquely beneficial properties. So one point about our flora is that most of our flora is anaerobic. It lives outside of oxygen. And most of what we talk about and we take pills for is the aerobic fraction. And so bacteria, we can't really directly augment the anaerobic bacteria, but it turns out that fungi like Saccharomyces can be useful that way. Specifically, Saccharomyces have been studied for benefiting acne, for helping carbohydrate digestion, especially disaccharides like maltose or lactose. It's also been shown to be effective for antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And this is a big deal. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but yeah, it's not just a matter of having uncomfortable bowels for a few days. It can be life-threatening. Saccharomyces also has good data about it warding off Clostridium difficile, H. pylori. It may be a benefit for Crohn's disease as well. Good evidence about it being useful for irritable bowel syndrome, for parasitic infections such as giardiasis or blastocystis hominis. Then we think about the main bacteria. And probably our best studied one there would be Lactobacillus acidophilus. All the Lactobacillus strains, they're generators of lactic acid. And lactic acid is a good thing in the intestinal tract. I won't go too far on this aside, but it's also a good thing in the muscles. Lactic acid doesn't make your muscles burn. It doesn't make you tired. It's a fuel your muscles use. Kind of a funny thing, not expected. So lactic acid compounds help with absorption of minerals. Things like calcium, copper, magnesium, manganese. They also fight the bad versions of yeast. And that's true in the vaginal tract and also in the intestinal tract. They can decrease symptoms of IBS. They may also lower cholesterol, make weight loss easier, and reduce duration and severity of cold and flu symptoms. We think about strains like Paracasei. This one specifically has benefits against Staph aureus, and it may also be good against just allergic runny nose, allergic rhinitis. Then the other big family we've got, the other genus I should say, is Bifidobacterium. And of that, there's a couple species. Bifidum is one. This one can compete with a lot of chronic low-grade bad bacteria. Some bad strains of E. coli, Staph aureus, Campylobacter jejuni, again, H. pylori. More good data about this one helping IBS and constipation. We also have Bifidobacter lactis, more data on allergies. This one specifically may have some use for lactose intolerance. Can also help blood sugar, and it may change the whole bowel permeability situation. Lactobacillus rhamnosus. This one's got good data about respiratory infections and acute gastroenteritis. Plantarum, this may be relevant for Th1 immunity. So yeah, lots of benefits of different types. So how often are these things prescribed? How often do doctors use them? Well, one big survey at Stanford said that about 61% of practitioners do recommend probiotics, foods, or supplements. The most common indication was for antibiotic-resistant diarrhea. And in safety, again, generally pretty safe. There have been cases of bacteremia in immunocompromised hosts. Those are pretty rare. For whatever reason, Lactobacillus casei and rhamnosus have been the main culprits that way. So if you're on chemotherapy, immunosuppressant medication because of an organ transplant or severe arthritic autoimmune disease, HIV, yeah, if a doctor recommends it and has some reasons for that, so be it. But otherwise, with those situations, you would not. There's also a concern that there could be a translocation of antibiotic resistance genes. That's kind of an odd thing, but there were a few cases of those who had weakened immune systems to where they were exposed to a version of lactobacillus that was vancomycin resistant, and then their gut bacteria got vancomycin resistant. So one more thing to think about. Now, here's where I got excited about this, is what are the thyroid-specific effects? So I'm always thinking about this. If you've got thyroid disease, how does this really apply to you? Is this a general good idea, or there are some positive things? Well, there was one pretty good study showing that the benefit of probiotics might mean that you need less thyroid medication, that your thyroid is working better again. So in this one, they compared two groups of about 40 people, and for 2 months they were taking a probiotic, one group was not, and they were tracking thyroid function. Those on the probiotic group, they lowered their dosage 4 times. Now the control group, they had to raise their medications several times. So pretty shocking. This was specifically lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, and it wasn't all that long. It was a rather short time frame to see that big of a shift. Another clinical trial were those that were defined as being hypothyroid, 60 people tracked for a couple months, and they saw significant changes in terms of all their scores moving further from hypothyroidism. They saw their TSH get lower, which is a good thing there, and T3 levels improve, and they often had a need for reductions in medication. So that was a cool finding. Other papers have shown that those with thyroid disease that are prone to constipation, probiotics may lower that symptom, may get them better regularity. Brief aside, I've seen more evidence about RS being helpful, but it's not like gentle overnight relief. So yeah, it's not you take RS and now you're pooping all over. No, but over the course of the coming weeks, really common to see better regularity. So that's consistent. Also data showing that probiotics can act as immunostimulants. Now, that's a scary thing with autoimmune disease. So that's come up. They said, well, if you're stimulating the immune system, is that going to worsen your body's attack against your thyroid? And the evidence for that is this is not a concern. It would not expect to cause progressions of autoimmune thyroid disease. However, we do see that some versions of lactobacillus may bind and cause changes in the lab readings for anti-thyroid peroxidase and anti-thyroid globulin. So I've talked a lot about your thyroid lab tests and how many things can give you goofy results. But here's one more to add to the list. If you've taken a probiotic within the days prior to your lab tests, you may skew your thyroid antibodies because of that. You may have falsely higher elevations. So that was about thyroid disease. So what are other well-studied indications? The biggest one we've had is the antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And again, a big deal. So lots of evidence that you'd want to do a probiotic with an antibiotic. There was actually one study that I looked at arguing the opposite, arguing that taking probiotics could delay the recurrence of your own flora. Now, this is a rather limited study. It was done on an animal model. There were some human flora tests done, but no big outcomes, meaning did they get sick or not in other ways. And the outcomes are significant. So we've got a lot of data showing that antibiotic-associated diarrhea is fatal for a high percent of people. Many get it. A large number will get it when they take an antibiotic, and of those, a surprising percent do not survive. So it's worth preempting. And the protocol there is to use a probiotic. If you're choosing one, I would choose the Saccharomyces for that purpose. Probably have a bit more data than bacteria do. You would take it while you're taking the antibiotic. To be really precise, you wouldn't take the pills at the exact same time. But if they're even an hour separated, that could be fine. And take it as long as you're taking the probiotic. Now, most guidelines just say to take them as long as you're taking the other. I encourage adding on 2 more weeks. So yeah, add 2 weeks past when you finish the antibiotic, and that can go a long ways towards cutting the risk of antibiotic-associated diarrhea. So, and that's the thing too, is that this is something that's not just a nuisance. It's definitely worth treating. The other big condition that's been well studied is atopic disease. So that's like airborne allergies and asthma. Eczema falls under the heading of atopic disease, but not a lot of data on eczema, but a lot of data about airborne allergies, especially allergic rhinitis, being useful. There's been quite a bit of research on ergogenic effects, meaning can it make an old guy run faster like me, or could it help athletes have some sort of an edge? And pretty good studies on that. No, there may be some benefit for recovery. You might recover faster and have less signs of chemical trauma, and less signs of stress, but you're not going to go any faster from them. So a lot of data about GI health as well. IBS, very well studied. Bacterial strains especially, well studied for irritable bowel syndrome. Clostridium difficile, now they won't treat a C. diff infection, but they can prevent complications from those that chronically have C. diff. Constipation, I mentioned that one. They can help stool consistency and bowel transit time, more effective in adults than kids for whatever reason. Crohn's disease, no big benefit for the disease or for symptom reduction, with the possible exception of Saccharomyces. Celiac, another bowel disease, has been studied. Probiotics might break down gluten, they might improve constipation, but there's no data saying they would allow you to have gluten without consequence. Quite a bit of data about H. pylori. especially for kids that are being treated for H. pylori, or adults who are treated who may get antibiotic-associated diarrhea. In those cases, yes, probiotics are useful, as they are for generalized infectious diarrhea. And ulcerative colitis, this is one to where we can see some degree of benefit and some change in relapse rate as well, as far as the last of the bowel diseases. Lactose intolerant, this has been studied. Inconsistent, we might see some benefit by lactobacillus. We also can think about pancreatitis, not helpful, might even increase the risk of complications. So pancreatitis is something to where when it's acute, someone generally is doing inpatient treatment, so you wouldn't so much be self-treating, but just to be aware of that, you wouldn't want probiotics. Periodontitis, we've got more data arguing that probiotics are good for your gums. They may cut the risk of the need for treatment. Protein breakdown, they may improve protein assimilation. So I've talked a lot about the importance of protein. Some consume enough but assimilate too little, and their flora could be a function of that. Rheumatoid arthritis, quite a few big studies, no clear benefit. No drawback, but no obvious help. Now, weight loss is pretty fascinating. This has been looked at quite a bit, and there have been theories about things like the Firmicutes-Bacteroidetes ratio, and ironically, you want lower Firmicutes. I'm sure I wasn't the first to see this, but it looks like Firmicutes sounds like firm and cute if you look at the word outside of the normal pronunciation. So yeah, you want less of those to be firm and cute. And it turns out that to lower those and augment Bacteroides, many probiotics may be useful, but dietarily, the most powerful thing is the version of fiber we'll find in beans. So that's a powerful thing. Beans are great that way. One meta-analysis, a combination of many studies, found that probiotics do make a difference in terms of total weight loss, but especially body fat loss. So that's a big once-over. And again, quick recap, not everyone needs these. If you don't have ongoing major stress can kind of act like an antibiotic. You can break down your flora from that and cause it to be more compromised. So yeah, stress levels are not exorbitant, no real digestive symptoms, thyroid function is stable, no ongoing infections, good digestive function, good tolerance of carbohydrate. I wouldn't add those in on a daily basis if that sounds like you. And again, don't take them if you've got risks of being immunosuppressed. But if there are some issues, they can be useful. Fungal probiotics, good thing to make you more resistant to infections, to help treat any current infections, lower the risk for respiratory infections. Other things that would be a consideration would be if you do take a oral contraceptive or oral hormone replacement. They are also like weak antibiotics in that they strain your flora. I would include those there. Last things for fungal probiotics, struggles with chronic diarrhea or acne can be useful. Again, one of those once a day, 10 billion units, Saccharomyces boulardii is the main organism, and you can take that anytime is handy. There's no real drawback. It's also not refrigerated, which is super convenient. And bacteria, more a fan of the blends. I recommend, and I put together a blend that's Lactobacillus acidophilus, Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Lactobacillus paracasei, Bifidobacterium lactis, and bifidum. And that one, you want more like 100 billion units. We see more about the amounts being relevant. A single dose is good. The timing matters. Don't take it after you're digesting your meal. The idea there is when you're surging your stomach acid, they probably won't do as well. But as the meal is starting or before a meal, totally fine. Other indications for bacterial probiotics, didn't mention this, but fatty liver, also some good data they can be useful that way. Mentioned hypothyroidism, mentioned high stress, irritable bowel syndrome, unstable thyroid levels, constipation, ulcerative colitis, chronic airborne respiratory allergies. They can be useful. So there's some thoughts about that. If nothing else, it's always good to add in a big mixture of dietary fibers. I'll make sure there's a link in this post where you can get my definitive fiber guide. It's this chart that shows you, I think it's 16 different types of fibers, all the foods they come from, all the various types of flora that they support, and you can be really targeted. You can add in particular foods for particular strains of good bacteria, so really handy. But yeah, add in a range of dietary fibers. If you have some of these ongoing conditions, you may choose to add a fungal bacterial probiotic. You can safely do both, but think about the reasons for them and be targeted and specific with that. All right, Dr. C here with you, and I'll see you real soon. Take care.